The unthinkable target. The stars shimmered like scattered diamonds over the endless void, their light a constant reminder of the infinite possibilities and dangers that existed in the universe. Deep within the Reshar Dominion's command vessel, the Obliterator, Commander Zorak stood tall, his towering frame outlined by the pulsating glow of the ship's control interface. His dark, metallic exoskeleton gleamed faintly under the dim lights of the war room, where he and his council were locked in heated debate over their next conquest. This is it. Zorak's deep, resonant voice filled the chamber as he gestured to the holographic projection of a blue and green planet, Earth. This insignificant, primitive speck of rock is our target. The question was met with a chorus of uneasy nods from his advisors. Tivarl, his second-in-command and the most analytical mind among them, stepped forward. Her sleek, serpentine form shimmered with nervous energy. "Yes, Commander," she said, her voice measured but laced with caution. "The Council has determined that Earth is the ideal target. Its resources are abundant, its strategic location optimal, and its inhabitants." She paused, her luminescent eyes narrowing. "Well, they are hardly a threat to a species as advanced as ours." Zorak tilted his head, the metallic ridges of his crown catching the faint starlight filtering through the ship's observation window. "Hardly a threat, you say? Yet they have repelled the Drask hordes and outmaneuvered the Xylth in the past. How does a species that uses rudimentary projectile weapons and clings to primitive technology manage to survive where others have fallen?" The room fell silent. The Council had debated this very question for cycles, unable to reconcile humanity's apparent simplicity with their surprising resilience. Tivarl cleared her throat. "They are resourceful. Their adaptability is unlike anything we've encountered. But make no mistake, Commander, they are no match for the Reshar Dominion. Their victories were flukes, nothing more." Zorak let out a low, guttural laugh. "Flukes, you say? I've lived long enough to know there is no such thing in war. Every victory has a reason. Every survival has a cost. What are we missing?" The Council exchanged uneasy glances. None dared to speak. Finally, Zorak stepped forward, his clawed hand passing through the holographic display of Earth. "Prepare the fleet," he commanded, his voice cold and unwavering. "If this species is truly as primitive as you claim, then they will fall quickly. If not..." He let the words hang in the air, his mandibles clicking in anticipation. "Then we will discover what makes them so dangerous. A world unaware." On Earth, in the dense forests of Montana, a small group of humans sat around a campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Jim Carter, a former military strategist turned survivalist, leaned back against a fallen log, puffing on a cigar as he listened to the sound of the night. "You know," Jim said, exhaling a plume of smoke, "they say the stars we see tonight are already dead. Their light's just taken its sweet time to get here." Beside him, his best friend and fellow veteran, Jenkins, snorted. "That's a real cheery thought, Jim. Got any more philosophical gems to share, or can we get back to planning tomorrow's hike?" Jim chuckled, tossing a twig into the fire. "Just saying. Makes you think. All that emptiness out there, and here we are, sitting on this little blue dot, thinking we're the center of the universe." "Maybe we are," said Sarah, the youngest member of their group, her voice light with curiosity. She was a scientist with a fascination for the unknown, her eyes constantly scanning the stars. "I mean, who's to say we're not the most advanced species out there?" Jim raised an eyebrow. "You really believe that, kid? With all the chaos we've got down here, you think we're the pinnacle of evolution?" Sarah shrugged. "It's not about being perfect. It's about surviving. And we're pretty damn good at that." Jenkins laughed. "She's got a point. We've survived wars, plagues, and each other. If there's one thing humans are good at, it's not dying." Jim smirked, but before he could respond, a low rumble shook the ground beneath them. The fire flickered, and the group instinctively reached for their weapons, Jim's old hunting rifle, Jenkins' sidearm, and Sarah's emergency flare gun. What the hell was that? Jim growled, his eyes scanning the treetops. Jenkins stood, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon. Probably just a quake. These forests are full of fault lines. But Sarah shook her head, her face pale. That wasn't a quake. That was something else. The first glimpse. High above, in the silent expanse of space, the Obliterator and its fleet descended toward Earth, their sleek, dagger-like forms cutting through the void. The Reshar Dominion had mobilized its full force, thousands of ships, millions of soldiers, all converging on the unsuspecting planet below. Zorak stood at the helm of his ship, his gaze fixed on the blue and green orb growing larger with each passing moment. "Activate the scanning array," he ordered. "I want a full analysis of their defenses." Tivarl moved swiftly to comply, her hands dancing over the glowing controls. A moment later, the holographic display of Earth flickered, revealing a patchwork of satellites, ground-based defenses, and scattered military installations. Zorak studied the image, his mandibles clicking in thought. Is this all? Where are their orbital weapons? Their planetary shields? Tivarl hesitated. They don't have any, Commander. Their technology hasn't progressed to that level. Zorak's laughter echoed through the chamber. No shields. No orbital platforms. They've left their world as exposed as a hatchling in a storm. This will be easier than I thought. But deep in his gut, a feeling he couldn't quite place began to gnaw at him. It wasn't fear. It was curiosity. What kind of species would leave themselves so vulnerable and yet survive for so long? "Prepare the drop pods," he said finally. "Let us greet these humans and show them the might of the Reshar Dominion." As the fleet descended, Jim and his group stared up at the sky, where streaks of light began to cut through the atmosphere. Sarah's breath hitched, her voice trembling. "Those aren't shooting stars." Jim's eyes narrowed. "No, they're not." He stood, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his cigar discarded in the dirt. "Looks like we've got company." The unexpected resistance. The Reshar fleet descended toward Earth like a swarm of metallic locusts, their dagger-shaped vessels slicing through the atmosphere with eerie precision. Each ship radiated an ominous hum, a sound that vibrated through the fabric of the air itself, sending shockwaves rippling across the ground. The once serene Montana night was shattered by the roar of alien engines, the stars above obscured by the fiery glow of descending craft. On the ground, Jim Carter stood motionless, his sharp eyes locked onto the sky as the alien vessels grew closer. Behind him, Sarah and Jenkins exchanged worried glances, their fear palpable. "Those aren't fireworks," Jenkins muttered, his grip tightening on his pistol. "No kidding," Jim replied, his voice low and steady. He shouldered his rifle, its weight familiar and comforting despite the sheer absurdity of the situation. "We've got visitors, and I doubt they're here for a friendly chat." Sarah's voice trembled as she stepped closer to him. "What do we do?" "They have ships, Jim. Advanced technology. What can we possibly do against that?" Jim turned to her, his expression calm but resolute. "We do what humans do best. Adapt, fight, and survive." As if to punctuate his statement, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. A deafening roar filled the air as the first of the Reshar drop pods smashed into the earth, sending dirt and debris flying in every direction. The cylindrical pods hissed and groaned as their metallic exteriors cooled, steam billowing from their vents. Jenkins swore under his breath. "They're not wasting time, are they?" Jim motioned for them to move. "Fall back to the tree line. We need cover." The trio sprinted toward the dense forest, the glow of the alien vessels casting long shadows ahead of them. Jim's mind raced as he formulated a plan, the survivalist instincts honed from years of military service kicking in. He knew they were outmatched, but retreat wasn't an option. The Reshar strike team. From the first drop pod emerged Zorak himself, his tall, imposing frame silhouetted against the fiery remains of the landing site. His bioluminescent patterns glowed brighter than ever, a display of dominance and confidence. Behind him, a dozen Reshar soldiers stepped forward, their sleek, black armor gleaming in the light of the flames. Each soldier carried a weapon that seemed to hum with restrained power, a stark contrast to the crude projectile weapons humans relied on. Zorak surveyed his surroundings, his mandibles clicking in amusement. "So this is the Great Earth," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Hardly worth the effort." Tivarl's voice crackled through his communicator. "Commander, preliminary scans show no significant resistance in the area. Their military installations are miles away. You should encounter minimal opposition." Zorak chuckled. "Perfect. Let's clean up this primitive backwater and move on." He raised a clawed hand, signaling his troops to advance. The Reshar soldiers moved with mechanical precision, their weapons scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. The first shots. From their hiding spot deep within the forest, Jim, Jenkins, and Sarah watched the Reshar soldiers fan out across the field. The aliens moved with an almost predatory grace, their glowing forms eerily silent despite their size. "They're spreading out," Jenkins whispered, crouched behind a fallen tree. "Looking for something, or someone." "Us," Jim replied grimly. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched her flare gun. "Jim, we can't fight them. Not like this. Look at their armor, their weapons. We don't stand a chance." Jim's gaze remained fixed on the aliens. "They don't know this terrain. We do. That's an advantage." Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "And what's your plan, Captain Obvious?" Jim smirked, his eyes glinting with determination. "We hit them where it hurts." He reached into his backpack, pulling out an old but reliable smoke grenade. With a quick twist, he activated it and tossed it into the clearing. The grenade hissed and sputtered, releasing a thick cloud of white smoke that quickly enveloped the area. The Reshar soldiers froze, their glowing visors flickering as they tried to adjust to the sudden loss of visibility. "Now," Jim barked, motioning for Sarah and Jenkins to follow. The trio moved swiftly through the underbrush, using the chaos to their advantage. Jim raised his rifle, taking careful aim at one of the disoriented soldiers. He fired, the sharp crack of the gunshot cutting through the air. The bullet struck the alien square in the chest, the impact knocking it off balance. To Jim's surprise, the armor didn't disintegrate or deflect the shot entirely. Instead, the alien stumbled, a faint crack appearing in its chest plate. "They're not invincible," Jim muttered, a flicker of hope igniting within him. Jenkins, emboldened by the sight, opened fire as well, his shots forcing the Reshar soldiers to take cover behind their pods. Zorak growled in frustration, his mandibles clicking angrily. So the primitives have some fight in them after all. How quaint. He raised his weapon, a sleek energy rifle that emitted a low, menacing hum. Taking careful aim, he fired a single shot into the smoke, the beam of energy slicing through the air like a blade. The beam struck a tree, reducing it to splinters in an instant. Jim winced as debris rained down around them. "We need to move. Now." The trio scrambled deeper into the forest, the sounds of alien weapons firing behind them. Jim's mind raced as he tried to think of their next move. They couldn't run forever, and the Reshar wouldn't stop until they were captured, or worse. The shift in power. As they ran, Sarah suddenly stopped, her eyes lighting up with realization. "Wait." Jim skidded to a halt, turning to face her. "What is it?" She pointed to the horizon, where the faint outline of an old, abandoned military outpost could be seen through the trees. "That's the research station I told you about earlier. It's been decommissioned for years, but there might still be equipment inside we can use." Jim hesitated, glancing back toward the clearing where the Reshar soldiers were regrouping. "You think there's anything in there that can help us?" "It's a long shot," Sarah admitted, "but it's better than nothing." Jenkins shrugged. "I say we go for it. Worst case scenario, we hole up and make our stand there." Jim nodded, gripping his rifle tightly. "All right, let's move." The trio made their way toward the outpost, their hearts pounding as the sound of alien pursuit grew louder behind them. Little did they know, their decision to fight rather than flee would mark the beginning of humanity's most defining battle, a battle not just for survival, but for the very soul of their species. And as the Reshar closed in, Jim couldn't help but smile. Let's show these aliens what humans are made of. The forgotten arsenal. The abandoned military outpost loomed in the distance, a skeletal reminder of Earth's past conflicts. Its weathered exterior, riddled with cracks and overgrown vegetation, suggested decades of disuse. Yet to Jim, Jenkins, and Sarah, it was a beacon of hope, a last stand against an enemy they barely understood. "Are you sure this place has anything we can use?" Jenkins asked as they jogged closer, his breath coming in short bursts. Sarah clutched her flare gun, her face pale but determined. It was a research facility before it was abandoned. If we're lucky, some of the experimental tech they were testing is still inside. Jim didn't slow down. Lucky, huh? Well, let's hope the universe is feeling generous today. Behind him, the faint hum of the Reshar soldiers' pursuit echoed through the forest. The aliens were closing in, their advanced tracking systems compensating for the terrain they didn't know. Time was running out. When they reached the outpost, Jim was the first to test the rusted metal door. It groaned but didn't budge. With a muttered curse, he stepped back and slammed the butt of his rifle into the old access panel beside the door. Sparks flew, and with a reluctant hiss, the door slid open just enough for them to squeeze through. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying the scent of dust and decay. The corridors were dimly lit by flickering emergency lights, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with them. "This place gives me the creeps," Jenkins muttered, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. Jim ignored him, his sharp eyes scanning the space. "Sarah, where's the equipment?" She took a moment to orient herself, recalling the blueprints she'd studied years ago. "There should be a weapons lab down this hall. Follow me." A race against time. As they moved deeper into the facility, the sound of distant footsteps and faint clicking echoed behind them. The Reshar soldiers were closing in. "They're already inside," Jenkins said, his voice tight. "Then we better find something useful, fast," Jim replied. They reached the weapons lab, a heavy door marked with faded warning signs in bold red letters. Sarah frantically keyed into the access panel, hoping the outdated security system still worked. To her relief, the door creaked open, revealing rows of dusty equipment, crates, and experimental prototypes. "Jackpot," Jenkins whispered, his eyes wide as he scanned the room. Sarah darted toward a console and began sifting through the scattered equipment. "These aren't conventional weapons," she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and fear. They were experimenting with energy amplifiers, electromagnetic disruptors. Some of this stuff was ahead of its time, even when it was built. Jim picked up what looked like a small handheld cannon, its barrel glowing faintly as he activated it. "Any of this going to help us against those things out there?" Sarah nodded. "If we can figure out how to use it, yes." These weapons weren't designed for conventional warfare. They were built to deal with threats humanity didn't understand yet. Jenkins let out a nervous laugh. "Well, looks like they're finally going to get used for what they were made for." The first engagement. The Reshar soldiers weren't far behind. Zorak led the charge, his glowing bioluminescence casting an ominous light in the dark corridors. He moved with the precision of a predator, his weapon humming softly in his claws. "They've barricaded themselves inside," one of his soldiers reported, gesturing to the sealed weapons lab. Zorak tilted his head, a hint of amusement flickering across his features. "Primitive creatures, hiding in their dens like frightened prey. Open it." The soldier stepped forward, activating a cutting tool that emitted a sharp blue beam. The metal door began to melt away under its searing heat. Inside, Jim and the others braced themselves. "They're coming," Jenkins said, gripping his sidearm tightly. "Sarah, get those weapons online," Jim ordered. "I'm trotting," she snapped, frantically connecting wires and activating long-dormant systems. A console lit up with a soft hum, and she quickly handed Jim a strange-looking rifle. "Here. This should work. It fires concentrated plasma bursts." Jim inspected the weapon, his fingers finding the trigger. "Looks fancy. Let's hope it packs a punch." The door finally gave way, and the first Reshar soldier stepped into the lab. Its glowing armor shimmered as it raised its weapon, aiming directly at Jim. Without hesitation, Jim fired the plasma rifle. A burst of searing blue energy shot forth, striking the soldier square in the chest. The alien staggered, its armor cracking under the impact before it collapsed to the ground. "Well, I'll be damned," Jenkins muttered, firing his sidearm at another soldier. The lab erupted into chaos. The Reshar soldiers stormed in, their weapons blazing, but the humans fought back with newfound vigor. Sarah activated an electromagnetic disruptor, and a pulse of energy rippled through the room, short-circuiting the aliens' visors and throwing their aim off. Jim and Jenkins took advantage of the confusion, picking off the disoriented soldiers one by one. Zorak watched from the doorway, his mandibles clicking in frustration. These humans were supposed to be primitive, weak, and yet they were holding their ground. "Enough," he growled, stepping forward with his energy rifle. A show of willpower. Zorak's presence in the room was like a gravitational force, his towering frame and glowing patterns exuding authority. He raised his weapon, firing a precise shot that narrowly missed Jim, instead vaporizing a console behind him. Jim turned to face the alien commander, his grip tightening on the plasma rifle. "You must be the big boss," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Zorak tilted his head. "You speak as though you have a choice in what happens next." Jim smirked. "I always have a choice." The two locked eyes, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "Humans," Zorak said, his voice filled with disdain. "So fragile, yet so defiant. Do you truly believe you can resist the might of the Reshar Dominion?" Jim didn't flinch. "We've been underestimated before. Ask the Drask." "Oh, wait. You probably can't. We sent them packing." Zorak's mandibles twitched, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Your arrogance will be your undoing." Jim raised his weapon. "Funny. I was just about to say the same thing." With that, the battle resumed, and the lab became a storm of energy blasts, plasma bursts, and sheer human determination. For every Reshar soldier that fell, another stepped forward. But Jim, Jenkins, and Sarah fought like cornered wolves, refusing to back down. Zorak couldn't understand it. These humans didn't have the numbers, the technology, or the physical strength to match his forces. Yet, they fought with a ferocity and resilience that bordered on madness. "They're relentless," he muttered, his grip on his rifle tightening. "What drives them?" He didn't know it yet, but he was about to find out. The turning point. The lab was in chaos, smoke and sparks filling the air as the clash between humans and aliens escalated to a fever pitch. The metallic walls reverberated with the sounds of plasma bursts, shouts, and the hum of alien technology. Yet, amidst the disorder, Jim Carter held his ground, his sharp instincts guiding him through the storm. "Sarah, we need another one of those disruptor pulses," Jim shouted over the din, ducking behind a metal console as a searing energy beam scorched past him. "I'm working on it," Sarah yelled back, her hands trembling as she rewired a device that looked like a cross between a generator and a power core. "I need another 30 seconds. Jenkins, crouched beside Jim, fired his sidearm at a Reshar soldier advancing through the haze. 30 seconds. We don't have 30 seconds. These bastards are closing in." Jim gritted his teeth, peering over the console. The Reshar soldiers were regrouping, their glowing armor flickering ominously as their adaptive systems recalibrated. Zorak, the towering commander, stood at the back, his cold, calculating gaze fixed on the humans. He wasn't just observing. He was studying them, learning their tactics, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Jenkins, cover Sarah. I'll draw their fire," Jim ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos. Jenkins gave him a skeptical look. "You've got a death wish, don't you?" "Just do it," Jim said, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "And try not to miss." Without waiting for a response, Jim darted out from behind the console, his plasma rifle blazing. He fired in controlled bursts, targeting the joints and visors of the Reshar soldiers. His movements were precise, almost instinctual, honed by years of military experience. The Reshar hesitated, momentarily thrown off by his bold maneuver. Jim used the distraction to reposition, drawing their fire away from Sarah and Jenkins. The spark of humanity. Zorak watched the human leader with a mixture of frustration and intrigue. This one, Jim Carter, was unlike the rest. He moved with purpose, his every action deliberate. He wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting to win. "Foolish," Zorak muttered under his breath, raising his weapon. But as he aimed at Jim, something unexpected happened. One of his soldiers fell, then another, their glowing visors shattered by precise shots from Jenkins' sidearm. The Reshar commander turned his gaze toward the younger human, his annoyance growing. "They're working together," Zorak observed, his voice laced with irritation. "Primitive creatures, yet their coordination is effective." He stepped forward, his bioluminescent patterns flaring brighter as he issued a command. "Advance. Overwhelm them. They cannot hold us off forever." The Reshar soldiers surged forward, their weapons blazing, but they were met with resistance unlike anything they had anticipated. Sarah finally activated the disruptor, and a pulse of electromagnetic energy rippled through the lab. The Reshar's advanced systems faltered, their visors flickering and their weapons momentarily losing power. "Now," Jim shouted, seizing the opportunity. He fired a well-aimed plasma burst at the nearest soldier, the shot piercing through its armor and sending it crashing to the ground. Jenkins followed suit, his bullets finding their marks with deadly precision. The humans were outnumbered, outgunned, and vastly outmatched, but their sheer determination kept them in the fight. The cost of defiance. The tide of the battle began to shift, but not without cost. Jenkins took a glancing hit from an energy beam, the searing impact burning through his jacket and leaving a charred wound on his shoulder. He stumbled, cursing under his breath. "I'm fine," he grunted, waving off Sarah's concerned glance. "Keep doing whatever it is you're doing." Sarah didn't respond. Her focus was on the makeshift weapon she was assembling from the scraps of alien tech scattered around the lab. It was risky, untested, and could very well blow up in her face, but it was their best shot. Meanwhile, Jim's attention was drawn to Zorak, who had finally stepped into the fray. The alien commander moved with a predatory grace, his energy rifle cutting through the smoke as he advanced. "So, you're the one leading this little rebellion," Zorak said, his voice cold and mocking. "Impressive, for a creature so limited." Jim smirked, raising his plasma rifle. "Funny, I was about to say the same thing about you." Zorak's mandibles twitched in what might have been amusement. "You think you can stop us? You're delaying the inevitable, human. Your kind will fall, as all primitives do." Jim's grip on his weapon tightened. "Maybe, but we won't make it easy for you." The two locked eyes, the tension between them palpable. A desperate gamble. Sarah's voice broke through the standoff. "Jim, I've got it." He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes widening as he saw the device she was holding. It looked like a hybrid of a plasma cannon and a generator, its barrel glowing with an unstable blue light. "What the hell is that?" Jenkins asked, wincing as he leaned against a console. "An energy destabilizer," Sarah explained, her voice trembling. "It should disrupt their armor systems and weapons for a short time. But it's volatile." Jim didn't hesitate. "Then we use it." Sarah nodded, positioning the device on a makeshift stand. She activated it, and the barrel began to hum, the light growing brighter. Zorek's eyes narrowed as he realized what was happening. "Stop them," he commanded, his soldiers surging forward. Jim and Jenkins opened fire, holding the Reshar at bay as Sarah prepared the destabilizer. The device emitted a high-pitched whine, the sound growing louder with each passing second. "Almost there," Sarah muttered, her fingers flying over the controls. The Reshar soldiers pressed closer, their weapons blazing despite the electromagnetic interference. Jim's rifle overheated, forcing him to switch to a sidearm. He gritted his teeth, refusing to back down. "Sarah, now would be a good time," he shouted. "Done," she cried, slamming her hand down on the activation panel. A blinding pulse of energy erupted from the destabilizer, washing over the lab like a tidal wave. The Reshar soldiers froze, their armor flickering and their weapons going dark. Zorek staggered, his bioluminescent patterns dimming as his systems struggled to compensate. Jim didn't waste the opportunity. He charged forward, his sidearm aimed directly at Zorek. The alien commander raised his weapon, but it sputtered uselessly in his claws. "You think this will save you?" Zorek growled, his voice strained. "No," Jim said, firing a shot that grazed Zorek's shoulder. "But it'll give us a fighting chance. A temporary victory." The pulse faded, and the Reshar soldiers began to recover, their systems rebooting. Jim, Jenkins, and Sarah knew they couldn't hold the lab much longer. "We need to fall back," Jim said, his voice firm. Jenkins frowned. "Fall back to where?" "We're out of places to hide." Sarah gestured to the far end of the lab. "There's a maintenance tunnel that leads outside. It's our only option." Reluctantly, Jim nodded. "All right, let's move." The trio retreated, covering each other as they made their way to the tunnel. Behind them, Zorek roared in frustration, his glowing patterns flaring once more. "This isn't over," he growled, his gaze fixed on the fleeing humans. But as they disappeared into the darkness, Jim couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. They had faced the impossible and survived. For now. "Let's see how they handle round two," he muttered, a determined smile on his face.